No one in the quiet farmland of central Wisconsin imagined that beneath the frost-covered soil and humble barns lay the fragments of a nightmare, one that would drift far beyond the town of Plainfield and take root in Hollywood's darkest stories. But on a cold November evening in 1957, when a hardware store owner vanished without a trace, a single trail of blood led investigators toward a lonely farmhouse and into a world that would reshape American horror forever. Inside, the air was still. A single bulb swung gently from the ceiling, illuminating dust that floated like drifting ash. Chairs sat where someone had once placed them decades earlier, untouched. The smell, damp earth, old wood, and something metallic clung to every surface. And in the center of that silence, Sheriff Art Schley pushed open a door, unaware that what waited on the other side would scar every man in that room for the rest of their lives. My name is Matthew, and this is the true story behind Ed Gein, the quiet, reclusive handyman whose crimes inspired Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs. If you find value in historical deep dives like this, feel free to subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Snow collected on the farmhouse roof that winter, muting the wind across the fields. For decades, locals barely noticed the man who lived there. Ed Gein walked Main Street with his cap low over his eyes, buying kerosene, canned goods, and salt blocks for animals he didn't even own. He smiled when spoken to. He offered to do odd jobs. He blended in so well that people almost forgot he was there. But long before the doors of his farmhouse swung open to authorities, Plainfield had already been shaped by the Gein family. Ed's mother, Augusta, ruled the household with a doctrine forged from fire and scripture. She taught her sons, Edward and his older brother, Henry, that the world was drowning in sin. Women, she insisted, were instruments of corruption. Outsiders were poison. Only absolute obedience to her would keep them safe. Their father, George, drifted through the days in a haze of alcohol, unable to challenge Augusta's towering presence. The isolation she demanded grew year after year. The boys were kept from school events, friendships, even casual conversation. The four of them lived as if sealed inside an invisible boundary drawn around the farm, a place where time stopped and reality bent to Augusta's will. When George died in 1940, and Henry followed 5 years later under circumstances that still raise questions, Augusta clung to Edward as tightly as she clung to her vision of righteousness. For Ed, she wasn't merely a mother. She was his world, his compass, his entire understanding of right and wrong. When she suffered a debilitating stroke, and later another that took her life in December 1945, the farmhouse fell silent in a way it never had before. Neighbors recalled seeing Ed drift through town afterward, as though permanently stunned. Something hollow had entered his expression. He boarded up Augusta's bedroom, leaving it exactly as she had kept it, immaculate, untouched, preserved. Then he withdrew deeper into his solitude. In the years that followed, small disturbances rippled through Plainfield. Tools disappeared. Livestock vanished from farms. Children told stories of strange shapes moving across the fields at night, though no one looked closely enough to confirm them. To the townspeople, Ed remained the quiet, somewhat odd man who helped repair fences or cleared snow for a few dollars. Yet inside the farmhouse, Ed was sinking into a world of his own design. Old newspapers were scattered across the kitchen table. Headlines about anatomy, medical experiments, cannibal tribes, and notorious crimes covered every surface. His fascination grew quietly, almost invisibly, as if he were building a private universe out of other people's darkness. And when he visited local graves under the cover of night, digging into the frozen earth, he believed he was doing something that blurred the line between devotion and delusion. On November 16, 1957, the first undeniable sign that something was deeply wrong appeared at Warden's hardware store. Bernice Warden's, the well-liked owner, didn't arrive home for lunch. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden's, found a shop's cash register open, a smear of blood on the floor, and a receipt for antifreeze bearing Ed Gein's name, lying near the counter. The search for Ed began immediately. As officers combed the back roads and forest edges, the sun dipped below the tree-line. By the time they reached his farmhouse, night had swallowed the fields. A deputy's flashlight swept across the sagging porch, the warped boards, the peeling paint. No sound came from inside. Sheriff Schley forced the door open. At first, it was the smell that stopped him. The cold night air could not mask what lingered there. His beam traveled slowly across the kitchen. Pots rested haphazardly on the stove, filled with substances no one wanted to identify. The refrigerator hummed faintly. Then the light caught something hanging from a crossbeam. It had once been Bernice Warden's. The scene froze every breath in the deputies' chests. What they found next, objects fashioned from human skin, boxes of bones, masks shaped from faces, was unlike anything American law enforcement had witnessed before. Yet in the silence of that farmhouse, with the wind rustling through the cracks in the walls, the only sound was Schley whispering to himself, as if trying to steady his mind. This isn't possible. Outside, Ed was calmly taken into custody. He did not resist. He did not argue. He simply told the officers that his mother would have been upset by the mess. What investigators needed to understand now was how this man, polite, quiet, helpful, had become the architect of a nightmare that would fuel decades of cultural fear. And to understand that transformation, they had to go back to the beginning. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and faintly humming with the sound of a radiator struggling against the Wisconsin cold. Ed sat quietly, hands folded, his expression almost serene. Detectives moved carefully around him, as though he were made of thin glass that might shatter with the wrong question. When they asked about Bernice Warden's, his response came in a quiet monotone, spoken with the calmness of a man describing a simple chore. Yes, he had been at the store. Yes, he had taken her. But the details dissolved into fragments of memory, half-truths, and images pulled from the recesses of a mind shaped by isolation and obsession. When the questions deepened, when they shifted toward the objects found in his home, the remains, the artifacts, Ed spoke with an eerie detachment. He described nights spent in graveyards, illuminated only by moonlight and the distant flicker of lanterns. He told investigators that he would fall into a kind of trance, wandering among the headstones as though drawn by some invisible thread. When asked why he dug up those buried there, why he constructed items from their remains, he answered softly that he was trying to be closer to his mother. Forensic teams entered the farmhouse in daylight, a stark contrast to the night the deputies first discovered its horrors. The cold sunlight fell across floors littered with newspapers, burlap, and clothing that had not been worn in decades. The rooms smelled of decay and neglect, layered over each other like sediment. Augusta's bedroom remained untouched, perfectly preserved. It was a shrine, frozen in time, untouched by the darkness that thrived in the rooms beyond it. The investigators cataloged everything with clinical precision. The remains of multiple individuals were identified through dental records and missing person reports from the region. What they uncovered was not a series of murders on the scale of what Hollywood would later invent, but a pattern of grave robberies and 2 confirmed killings. Bernice Warden's and Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who vanished in 1954. Yet the depth of Ed's obsessions, the grotesque creations he had assembled, and the violence he carried out left the nation stunned. News of the crimes spread quickly. Reporters flooded into Plainfield, racing down quiet roads that had rarely experienced more than the rumble of tractors and the occasional truck. Headlines cast Ed as a monster, a ghoul, a figure too disturbing for the public to fully comprehend. For the first time, Americans saw the ordinary landscape of farmland and small towns through a different lens. Not as places insulated from the darkest impulses of human nature, but as grounds where horror could grow unnoticed. Court proceedings began in early 1958, though the trial itself would be delayed for years. Doctors conducted extensive psychiatric evaluations, peeling back the layers of Ed's psyche. They found a man deeply scarred by emotional abuse, isolation, and a pathological attachment to his mother. He suffered from severe mental illness, including psychosis. To the court, he was not a cold-blooded predator, but a profoundly damaged individual who had built his world around delusion. In January 1958, Ed Gein was declared legally insane. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, later transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute. There he lived quietly, knitting belts for staff members, gardening, and speaking softly to anyone who asked him a question. The same eerie calmness he displayed during the investigation would follow him for decades. But while Ed faded into institutional obscurity, the cultural impact of his crimes expanded far beyond Wisconsin's borders. When novelist Robert Bloch learned of the case, he saw in Ed a chilling template for a fictional character, a quiet man living in isolation, consumed by the memory of his mother, capable of unspeakable acts beneath an unassuming exterior. From that seed grew Norman Bates in Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock transformed Bloch's idea into a cinematic landmark, embedding the terror of hidden domestic madness into American consciousness. Years later, filmmakers drew inspiration from the brutal tools found within Ed's farmhouse to shape Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a figure defined not by Ed himself, but by the atmosphere of dread his crimes had evoked. And in 1991, the psychological complexity of his obsessions influenced the character of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, whose fixation on transformation echoed the darkness uncovered in Plainfield. Ed Gein never saw these films. He never understood the scale of the legend that formed around him. To him, the world remained limited to the hospital grounds where he walked slowly along the pathways each morning, his eyes unfocused, his thoughts drifting back to a farmhouse that no longer stood. Plainfield, however, felt the weight of his legacy. The town became an unwilling landmark in America's dark mythology. Some residents refused to speak his name. Others felt anger toward journalists and filmmakers who transformed their quiet community into a symbol of terror. The farm itself was burned in 1958, possibly by arson, leaving only ash and charred earth. The land was eventually cleared, and nothing marks the site today. It is as if the town tried to erase the memory with fire. But history rarely fades so easily. Ed Gein died in 1984 at the age of 77. He was buried beside his family in Plainfield Cemetery. Over the years, visitors chipped away fragments of his gravestone until it was eventually removed for safekeeping. The patch of ground where he rests is now unmarked, blending into the rows of ordinary graves. It is an eerie symmetry, the man who disrupted the dead, now lying anonymously among them. And yet, his story endures, not because of the number of his crimes, but because of what those crimes revealed about the fragility of the familiar. The farmhouse, the hardware store, the gravel roads. These were pieces of everyday American life. Ed Gein transformed them, unwillingly and unknowingly, into symbols that would haunt popular culture for generations. The legacy of his violence is a reminder that true horror does not require scale. Sometimes it emerges quietly, shaped by isolation, trauma, and a mind slipping beyond the reach of reality. And sometimes the most unsettling monsters are not the ones created by screenwriters, but the ones whose lives unfold unnoticed, hidden in plain sight, until a single moment exposes everything. Thank you for watching. If you reach the end, comment Plainfield to let me know you were here.